My wife said her yoga guru taught her sacred intimacy. I didn't argue. I just reached for my bourbon and wondered when enlightenment became a contact sport. Nathan, you're being cynical again, Iris said, adjusting her meditation cushion in our living room. The morning light caught the crystal hanging from her neck, another gift from Soren Valk, her spiritual teacher. Sacred intimacy is about opening your heart chakra to receive divine love. Right, I said, sipping my coffee. And here I thought intimacy was something married people shared with each other. She gave me that look, the one that said I was spiritually deficient, emotionally unavailable, and probably destined for several lifetimes as a slug. After 15 years of marriage, I knew that expression well. Soren says closed-minded people project their limitations onto others, she continued, rolling out her yoga mat. Maybe if you attended one of his workshops, you'd understand. I'm Nathan Blackwood, 41 years old, former Seattle police detective turned private security consultant. I specialize in corporate surveillance and background checks, work that requires attention to detail and a healthy skepticism about human nature. Both qualities served me well on the force, and both were setting off alarm bells about my wife's new spiritual awakening. Iris had discovered the Lotus Ashram 6 months ago. What started as weekend yoga classes had evolved into daily sessions, private lessons, and overnight retreats. Our conversations, once filled with shared jokes and comfortable silences, now revolved around chakras, energy healing, and the profound wisdom of Soren Valk. I have a late session tonight, she said, not meeting my eyes. Soren is helping me work through some deep-seated blocks. What kind of blocks? I asked. Intimacy blocks, trust issues, the kind of emotional armor that prevents true connection. I watched her gather her things, the special mat, the organic water bottle, the journal where she recorded her spiritual insights. Everything about her morning routine had changed, reorganized around the ashram's schedule and Soren's teachings. When will you be home? Late. These sessions can't be rushed. Soren says breakthrough moments happen on their own timeline. After she left, I sat in the quiet house and tried to remember when my wife had started speaking in spiritual cliches. When had I love you become I honor your divine essence? When had our bedroom conversation shifted from planning vacations to discussing energy blockages? My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Marla. Coffee later? I have news about that background check you asked me to run. 3 weeks ago, I'd asked Marla to research Soren Valk. As a lawyer specializing in nonprofit law, she had access to databases and public records that could reveal information about the ashram's finances and Soren's credentials. I'd told myself it was just professional curiosity, due diligence about someone who'd become so influential in my wife's life. I met Marla at our usual spot, a coffee shop in Capitol Hill where the baristas knew our orders and the Wi-Fi was reliable. She slid a manila folder across the table. Your yoga guru is interesting, she said. Born Stefan Volker in Munich. Changed his name to Soren Valk when he moved to California 10 years ago. No formal training in yoga, psychology, or any kind of therapy. He's been running ashrams up and down the West Coast, usually staying in each location for 2 to 3 years before moving on. Moving on or getting run out of town? Hard to say. The pattern is consistent, though. He establishes a following, focuses on wealthy students, then disappears when things get complicated. There are some civil suits in his past, mostly former students claiming financial impropriety. I opened the folder and scanned the documents. Soren's real name, his visa status, his business registrations. The picture that emerged was of a man who understood how to monetize spiritual seeking. There's more, Marla said. I talked to a lawyer in Portland who represented 3 former students. They claimed Soren used his position to manipulate vulnerable women. Nothing criminal was ever proven, but the pattern is troubling. What kind of manipulation? The usual, convincing them that traditional relationships were spiritually limiting, that true growth required abandoning conventional morality. He positioned himself as the guide who could lead them to higher consciousness through intimate connection. I closed the folder and looked at my sister. Marla had always been protective, sometimes overly so, but her legal training made her cautious about making accusations without evidence. Nathan, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but Iris has been asking a lot of questions about our assets lately. She wanted to know about your retirement accounts, the house equity, your business insurance policies. She mentioned wanting to make a major donation to the ashram, I said. Something about supporting Soren's vision for expanding the healing work. How major? She talked about $50,000. Money from her inheritance, she said. Marla frowned. Her mother's inheritance was spent years ago on the house renovation. If she's talking about $50,000, she's talking about marital assets. I drove home through Seattle's afternoon traffic, thinking about patterns and evidence. In police work, you learn to distinguish between suspicion and proof, between gut feelings and actionable intelligence. I had suspicions about Soren Valk and concerns about my wife's behavior, but I didn't have proof of anything except poor judgment and spiritual gullibility. That changed when I got home and found Iris on the phone in our bedroom, speaking in a voice I'd never heard before. Breathy, intimate, completely unlike her normal tone. I can't wait to explore that with you, she was saying. When you touch my heart chakra, I feel so open, so receptive. Yes, I understand. Sacred work requires sacred space. I'll make sure we're not interrupted. I stood in the hallway, listening to my wife make plans that sounded nothing like yoga instruction. When she ended the call, I walked into the bedroom as casually as I could manage. How was your day? I asked. Wonderful. Soren and I are making real progress on my intimacy blocks. He thinks I'm ready for advanced work, private sessions where we can go deeper without the distraction of other students. That sounds intensive. It is. Tomorrow night, we're doing a special session at the ashram. He's creating sacred space just for my healing journey. That evening, I sat in my home office and thought about surveillance. In my security consulting work, I installed cameras and monitoring systems for businesses worried about theft or employee misconduct. The equipment was sophisticated, discreet, and perfectly legal when used to protect property and assets. The Lotus Ashram was technically a business. Iris was a co-owner of our house, our bank accounts, and my consulting firm. If she was making financial decisions that affected our shared assets, I had a right to understand the full scope of what was happening. I spent the next morning researching the ashram's layout. The building had been a dance studio before Soren leased it, with large open spaces, mirrors, and high windows. I'd been there twice for community events, fundraisers where Soren demonstrated his teaching methods and talked about the transformative power of conscious living. The private session room was in the back, separated from the main studio by a curtained alcove. During my previous visits, I'd noticed the room had its own entrance through a side door, presumably for confidential counseling sessions. I called the ashram and spoke to Petra Lindgren, Soren's lead student and administrative assistant. Petra was 34, a former marketing executive who'd become devoted to Soren's teachings after her divorce 2 years earlier. She managed the ashram's social media presence and coordinated the workshop schedules. I'm interested in surprising my wife with some flowers for her session tomorrow night, I told her. Could you help me arrange delivery? That's so thoughtful, Petra said. Iris is doing such important work with Soren. She's really committed to her growth process. What time should I have them delivered? The session starts at 7, but they usually go until 10 or later. Sacred work can't be rushed, you know? I thanked her and hung up, then spent the afternoon shopping for surveillance equipment. Nothing illegal or invasive, just a basic security camera system that could be installed quickly and operated remotely. The kind of setup I'd recommend to any business owner concerned about after-hours activities on their property. The next evening, I watched Iris prepare for her session with unusual care. She showered, applied perfume, and chose her outfit with the attention she'd once reserved for our anniversary dinners. The yoga clothes she selected were more form-fitting than her usual practice wear. You look nice, I said. Soren says our physical presentation affects our energetic vibration. When we honor our bodies, we honor the divine within us. After she left, I drove to the ashram and parked 2 blocks away. The building was dark except for lights in the back room where Iris and Soren would be conducting their sacred work. I waited 30 minutes to ensure they were settled, then approached the building through the alley. The installation took 15 minutes. 2 small cameras, positioned to capture the private session room from different angles. The equipment was motion-activated and transmitted to a secure server that I could access remotely. Everything was legal, technically justified as security monitoring of a business that handled financial transactions and valuable equipment. I returned home and opened my laptop. The cameras were functioning perfectly, providing clear audio and video of the session room. What I saw made me reach for the bourbon. My wife was lying on a massage table, covered by a thin sheet. Soren stood beside her, his hands moving over her body in ways that had nothing to do with yoga instruction. Their conversation was intimate, personal, completely inappropriate for any legitimate therapeutic relationship. Your heart chakra is so blocked, Soren was saying in his slight European accent, but I can feel it opening under my touch. Can you feel the energy moving? Yes, Iris whispered. It's like you're awakening something that's been asleep for years. Sacred intimacy requires complete trust. You must surrender your conventional ideas about appropriate boundaries. In this space, we follow the guidance of divine love. I watched for 20 minutes, documenting everything. The touching, the whispered conversations, the gradual escalation from spiritual instruction to something that looked exactly like an affair disguised as enlightenment. When Iris came home at midnight, I was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine and a carefully neutral expression. How was your session? Transformative, she said, glowing with post-session energy. Soren helped me access parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I feel so alive, so connected to my authentic self. That's wonderful, I said. I'm happy you're finding what you need. She kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more like blessing than affection, and went upstairs to shower. I remained in the living room, planning my next moves. In police work, you learn that evidence is only valuable if it can be presented effectively. Raw surveillance footage might prove infidelity, but it wouldn't necessarily destroy the elaborate spiritual justification that Soren and Iris had constructed around their relationship. I needed to think bigger, more strategically. Soren Valk had built his influence by positioning himself as a spiritual authority, someone whose wisdom transcended conventional morality. His power came from the respect and trust of his students, the community of seekers who looked to him for guidance. If I could undermine that authority, expose the reality behind the spiritual facade, I could destroy more than just an affair. I could dismantle the entire system that had seduced my wife, and who knew how many other vulnerable people. I spent the next 3 days reviewing footage from additional sessions, building a comprehensive record of Soren's methods. The pattern was consistent, spiritual language used to justify increasingly intimate physical contact, conventional boundaries dismissed as obstacles to enlightenment, and my wife's gradual transformation from student to something that looked very much like a devoted lover. By Friday, I had enough evidence to prove adultery in divorce court, but I also had something more valuable, a clear picture of how Soren operated, how he used spiritual authority to manipulate his students, and how the entire ashram community had been constructed to enable his behavior. The question was how to use that information most effectively. I edited the footage with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to building criminal cases. No explicit content, nothing that crossed legal boundaries, but plenty of material that revealed the true nature of Soren's sacred intimacy teachings. The first video showed Soren explaining to Iris how traditional marriage created energetic blocks that prevented spiritual growth. His hands moved across her body as he spoke about releasing attachment to conventional relationships. Your husband represents the old paradigm, he said in the recording. A consciousness based on possession rather than divine love. To evolve, you must be willing to transcend these limitations. The second video captured a conversation about money. Soren explained how financial contribution to the ashram represented energetic investment in her spiritual development. The $50,000 donation wasn't just about supporting his work, it was about demonstrating her commitment to transformation. When you hold back financially, you hold back energetically, Soren told her. True students understand that abundance flows through generous giving. I compiled these clips into a 10-minute video that told a clear story. Soren Valk was using spiritual language to justify adultery and financial manipulation. I added subtitles highlighting key phrases and created a simple title, Sacred Intimacy, The Truth About Lotus Ashram. The next step was distribution. I created an anonymous email account and began researching the ashram's community. Petra Lindgren had done excellent work building their social media presence. The ashram's Facebook page listed 47 active students, plus another 100 people who'd attended workshops or community events. I sent the video to every email address I could find, along with a simple message: this is what's really happening in those private sessions. Every student deserves to know the truth. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 6 hours, the ashram's Facebook page was flooded with comments from shocked students. Some defended Soren, claiming the video was taken out of context or fabricated by enemies of the spiritual community. Others shared their own uncomfortable experiences with his teaching methods. Petra Lindgren emerged as an unexpected ally in the chaos. Rather than defending Soren, she began posting her own concerns about his behavior. I've been wondering about some things I've witnessed, she wrote in a Facebook comment that quickly received dozens of likes. This video confirms what several of us have suspected, but were afraid to discuss. By Sunday morning, the situation had escalated beyond social media gossip. 3 former students had contacted local news stations with their own stories about inappropriate conduct at the ashram. A reporter from the Seattle Times called the ashram's main number, leaving voicemails about an investigation into allegations of misconduct by spiritual leaders. I watched the developments from my home office, monitoring social media feeds and news websites. Iris had spent the weekend at an emergency healing retreat that Soren organized for his core students, damage control disguised as spiritual crisis management. When she returned Sunday evening, she was furious. Someone is trying to destroy everything we've built, she said, pacing around our living room. They've taken sacred moments out of context and twisted them into something ugly and profane. What kind of sacred moments? I asked. Private healing sessions? Intimate spiritual work that can only be understood by people who've reached a certain level of consciousness. It looked like an affair to me. She stopped pacing and stared at me. You watched it? Everyone watched it, Iris. The video has been shared 300 times since Friday. You don't understand what you saw. Soren is helping me heal wounds that go back lifetimes. The physical component is just one aspect of multidimensional therapy. I set down my coffee and looked at my wife, really looked at her. The woman I'd married had been practical, funny, occasionally cynical about human nature. This person speaking to me now sounded like she was reading from a script written by someone else. Do you hear yourself? I asked. You're defending adultery by calling it multidimensional therapy. It's not adultery, it's sacred work. Sacred work that you hid from your husband. Sacred work that requires private sessions and special donations. Sacred work that looks exactly like cheating when viewed by anyone who isn't part of your spiritual community. She sat down across from me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old Iris, uncertain, vulnerable, recognizing the absurdity of her situation. Nathan, I know this is hard to understand, but what Soren and I share transcends physical categories. We're working on a soul level, healing karmic patterns that have kept me trapped in limiting relationships. Limiting relationships like our marriage? Yes, she said quietly. I'm sorry, but yes. Our marriage represents old paradigm thinking. Possessiveness instead of unconditional love. Fear-based attachment instead of spiritual partnership. I nodded, absorbing the full scope of what she was telling me. My wife hadn't just had an affair, she'd been converted to a belief system that redefined adultery as enlightenment and marriage as spiritual imprisonment. What happens now? I asked. Soren thinks we should take some time apart while I continue my healing work. He's found a new location for the ashram, somewhere we can practice without interference from people who don't understand sacred intimacy. Where? The San Juan Islands. There's a retreat center available for long-term lease, a place where serious students can do deep work without external judgment. I spent Monday morning making phone calls, first to Marla, who immediately began researching divorce procedures and asset protection strategies, then to my business partner, who agreed to handle my client obligations while I dealt with personal matters. The third call was to Detective Ray Sullivan, my former partner in the Seattle Police Department. Ray had moved to the cybercrime unit and specialized in online harassment and digital evidence cases. I need advice about an ongoing situation, I told him. Someone is using video footage to damage a spiritual community, and I want to make sure everything stays within legal boundaries. What kind of footage? Surveillance video from a yoga studio. Someone installed cameras and recorded private sessions between a teacher and student. Was the installation legal? The person who installed the cameras had legitimate business reasons for monitoring the property, but the content is being distributed without consent from the people who were recorded. Ray was quiet for a moment. If the installation was legal and the footage shows activity in a commercial space, distribution probably falls under whistleblower protections, especially if there's evidence of professional misconduct or fraud. What if the people in the video claim their privacy was violated? They'd have to prove they had a reasonable expectation of privacy in a commercial building where they were conducting business transactions. Given what you're describing, that would be difficult to establish. I thanked Ray and hung up, satisfied that my actions were legally defensible. The next phase of my plan required more direct intervention. Tuesday morning, I drove to the Lotus Ashram and found a closed for spiritual renewal sign on the front door. Through the windows, I could see boxes stacked in the main studio, evidence of the rapid evacuation that Soren was conducting. I walked around to the alley and checked the back entrance. The door was unlocked, probably left open by students who were helping with the move. I entered the building and found Soren in the private session room, packing his personal items into a leather suitcase. "Mr. Blackwood," he said when he saw me. His European accent seemed more pronounced under stress. "I wondered when you might appear." "Soren, or should I call you Stefan?" He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Names are just labels. I've been many things to many people, including a fraud who preys on vulnerable women. I provide spiritual guidance to people who seek transformation. If conventional minds interpret that work through the lens of their own limitations, that's unfortunate but not my responsibility." I looked around the room where my wife had been convinced to abandon her marriage in favor of sacred intimacy. The massage table, the dim lighting, the crystals and candles that created an atmosphere of mystical significance around what was essentially a seduction routine. "Interesting setup," I said. "Very professional. How many wives have you enlightened in this particular space?" "I don't discuss my work with people who lack the consciousness to understand it. Try me. I'm more conscious than you might think." Soren closed his suitcase and faced me directly. He was taller than I'd expected, probably 6'2", with the kind of lean build that suggested regular yoga practice. His gray hair was pulled back in a small ponytail, and he wore expensive casual clothes that projected both spiritual authority and material success. Your wife came to me seeking something you couldn't provide, he said. Growth, understanding, connection to her authentic self. I helped her discover possibilities beyond the limitations of conventional marriage. You helped her discover adultery disguised as therapy. I helped her discover that love transcends the possessive structures that small minds mistake for relationship. I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the calculation in his eyes. Whatever else Soren Valk might be, he was intelligent enough to recognize a dangerous situation. Here's what's going to happen, I said. You're going to leave Seattle and never contact my wife again. You're going to close your ashram and find a new line of work, preferably one that doesn't involve manipulating married women. And you're going to return every penny that Iris gave you for her spiritual development. Or what? Or I release the rest of the footage, the parts that show exactly how you conduct your sacred intimacy sessions, the parts that would interest the IRS, the state licensing board, and probably immigration services. Soren's composure cracked slightly. You recorded private therapeutic sessions? That's a violation of what? Your right to pursue affairs in a commercial building? Your right to deceive students by selling spiritual services that are actually intimate encounters? I pulled out my phone and showed him a screenshot from one of the videos. Soren with his hands on my wife's body, both of them in a state of undress that had nothing to do with yoga instruction. This goes to every yoga association on the West Coast, I continued, plus the local news stations, the Better Business Bureau, and a few private investigators who specialize in tracking con artists who prey on spiritual communities. He stared at the image for several seconds, then looked back at me with something approaching respect. You're more resourceful than Iris indicated. Iris doesn't know me as well as she thinks. Neither do you. Soren picked up his suitcase and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. She won't forgive you for this. Destroying her spiritual community, exposing her private moments, forcing her to choose between her growth and her marriage. You'll lose her anyway. Maybe, I said, but you'll lose everything. After he left, I remained in the empty ashram for several minutes, absorbing the silence. The building felt different without the incense and meditation music, without the atmosphere of mystical significance that Soren had created around his operation. I walked through the main studio, looking at the mirrors and yoga props that had been abandoned in the rapid evacuation. On a shelf near the entrance, I found a stack of promotional flyers for the San Juan Islands retreat, the new location where Soren planned to continue his work with a smaller group of devoted students. The retreat center was called Sacred Shores, located on a private island accessible only by boat or seaplane. According to the flyer, it offered intensive spiritual immersion for serious practitioners who were ready to transcend conventional limitations and embrace authentic transformation. I folded one of the flyers and put it in my pocket. If Soren thought he could simply relocate his operation and continue manipulating vulnerable people, he was about to learn otherwise. Wednesday evening, Iris returned home with 2 suitcases and a determined expression. I'm going to the islands, she announced. Soren has created a beautiful space for advanced students, and I've been invited to join the founding community. For how long? As long as it takes to complete my transformation. This is my chance to fully embody the teachings without interference from people who don't understand spiritual work. I watched her pack additional clothes, books, and personal items. She moved with the focused energy of someone who'd made a major decision and was committed to following through regardless of consequences. What about us? I asked. I hope someday you'll understand what I'm doing, but I can't let your limitations prevent me from becoming who I'm meant to be. My limitations? Your need to control, to possess, to reduce everything to conventional categories. Soren says some people aren't capable of understanding unconditional love. She finished packing and stood by the door with her bags, looking at me with a mixture of sadness and determination. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to discuss our future, she said. But right now, I need to focus on my spiritual development. After she left, I sat in our quiet house and planned the next phase of my campaign. Soren had made a tactical error by moving his operation to an isolated location. Islands might provide privacy for his activities, but they also created vulnerabilities that a determined opponent could exploit. I spent the evening researching Sacred Shores Retreat Center, the San Juan Islands ferry schedules, and the legal requirements for operating spiritual communities in Washington state. If Soren wanted to play guru in paradise, he was about to discover that paradise could become a very uncomfortable place for fraudulent spiritual teachers. The San Juan Islands ferry terminal bustled with weekend tourists heading to their island getaways. I stood in line with my rental car, wearing hiking clothes and carrying a backpack that contained surveillance equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for several days of reconnaissance work. Sacred Shores Retreat Center occupied 15 acres on the northern tip of Crane Island, accessible by private ferry or chartered boat. According to the website, it offered pristine natural beauty and complete privacy for intensive spiritual work. The promotional photos showed meditation gardens, rustic cabins, and a main lodge overlooking Puget Sound. I'd spent the past week researching the retreat center's history and current operations. The property had been a corporate retreat facility before being converted to a spiritual community. The current lease was held by a nonprofit organization called Divine Transformation Institute, one of several shell companies that Soren had established to manage his various ashrams and workshops. More importantly, I'd discovered that Sacred Shores was hosting a conscious relationship workshop this weekend, featuring Soren's teachings on sacred intimacy and spiritual partnership. According to the registration materials, 12 couples had paid $5,000 each to attend the intensive program. My plan was simple: document Soren's methods, gather evidence of his fraudulent practices, and create a comprehensive record that would destroy his credibility and force him to abandon his spiritual teacher persona permanently. The ferry ride to Crane Island took 40 minutes. I spent the time reviewing maps and photographs of Sacred Shores, identifying the best locations for surveillance, and planning my approach to the property. The retreat center's dock was busy with arrivals when the ferry reached the island. I watched from the car deck as workshop participants disembarked with their luggage, guided by staff members wearing flowing white clothes and welcoming smiles. I didn't see Iris among the arrivals, but I spotted Petra Lindgren directing traffic near the main lodge. She looked different than she had at the Seattle ashram, more confident, like someone who'd found her proper role in the organization. I drove past the retreat center entrance and continued to a public camping area 2 miles down the coast. The campground provided access to hiking trails that connected to the Sacred Shores property, allowing me to approach the retreat center through the forest without being detected. That evening, I hiked through the woods carrying my surveillance equipment. The retreat center was beautifully situated, with the main lodge and guest cabins arranged around a central garden area. Lights glowed in the windows, and I could hear music and laughter from the opening ceremony. I positioned myself in the tree line overlooking the main lodge and set up a telephoto camera with night vision capability. Through the large windows, I could see workshop participants gathered in a circle, listening to Soren speak about conscious relationship and spiritual intimacy. My wife sat directly across from Soren, wearing a white dress that made her look ethereal in the candlelight. She appeared completely absorbed in his presentation, nodding along with his explanations of how conventional marriage created energetic blocks that prevented authentic love. Traditional relationships are based on fear, Soren was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the open windows. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing control. But divine love transcends these limitations. When we release attachment to possessive structures, we open ourselves to unlimited connection. The workshop participants, mostly affluent couples in their 40s and 50s, listened with the attention of people who'd paid significant money to receive spiritual wisdom. Several took notes as Soren explained his theories about sacred intimacy and conscious partnership. Tomorrow, we'll begin practical exercises, he continued, working in pairs to explore energy exchange, boundary dissolution, and authentic emotional expression. Some of you may find these practices challenging to your conditioned beliefs about appropriate relationship behavior. After the evening session ended, I watched the participants return to their cabins. Iris walked alone to a small cottage near the water, while Soren retired to a larger cabin that appeared to serve as both his residence and private office. I spent the next 3 hours documenting the retreat center's layout and security measures. The property had minimal lighting and no visible cameras or alarm systems. The isolation that provided privacy for Soren's activities also made it easy for an experienced investigator to move around undetected. Saturday morning, I positioned myself with a clear view of the main lodge and began recording the workshop sessions. Soren's teaching methods were more sophisticated than I'd expected. He used group dynamics, peer pressure, and carefully structured exercises to break down participants' resistance to his unconventional ideas about relationships. The morning session focused on releasing attachment patterns. Participants were instructed to share their deepest fears about love and intimacy, while the group provided supportive feedback. The exercise created an atmosphere of vulnerability and emotional openness that made people more susceptible to Soren's influence. Notice how your fear of losing your partner creates possessive behavior, Soren told one couple who'd shared their struggles with jealousy. True love means wanting your partner to experience unlimited joy, even if that joy comes from connection with others. During the lunch break, I observed individual conversations between Soren and various participants. He had a gift for identifying people's emotional vulnerabilities and offering spiritual explanations for their relationship problems. With Iris, his approach was particularly manipulative. He positioned her as his assistant teacher, someone whose spiritual development had progressed beyond the limitations that still constrained other workshop participants. "You understand these concepts intuitively," he told her during a private conversation I recorded from the tree line. "Most people need years of practice to release their attachment to conventional relationship structures, but you've already transcended those limitations." The afternoon session introduced conscious touch exercises, partner work that involved physical contact, designed to explore energy exchange between souls. Soren demonstrated the techniques with Iris, showing the other participants how to channel divine love through sacred physical connection. What I witnessed was essentially a public seduction disguised as spiritual instruction. Soren's hands moved across my wife's body while he explained chakra activation and energy healing to the fascinated workshop participants. Notice how conventional minds interpret sacred touch through limiting physical labels, he said, as his hands lingered where they clearly didn't belong. But when we move beyond those constraints, human connection becomes a gateway to divine communion. Several participants looked uncomfortable with the demonstration, but none voiced objections. The group dynamic that Soren had established made dissent seem like spiritual immaturity rather than reasonable skepticism. That evening, I watched the participants gather for dinner and discussion of their workshop experiences. The conversations revealed how effectively Soren's methods were working. People who'd arrived as committed couples were now questioning their assumptions about fidelity, commitment, and appropriate relationship boundaries. "I'm starting to understand that my jealousy is really fear-based attachment," one woman told the group. "Maybe true love means being happy when my partner experiences joy with others." "Exactly," Soren confirmed. "Possessive love is actually a form of spiritual imprisonment. When we release our partners from the cage of exclusive relationship, we free ourselves as well." After dinner, Soren announced that Sunday's session would include advanced practices for participants who felt ready to embody the teachings through direct experience. He invited interested couples to sign up for private instruction that would take their understanding of sacred intimacy to deeper levels. I watched 6 couples volunteer for the advanced work, including several who'd seemed skeptical earlier in the weekend. Soren's combination of spiritual authority, group pressure, and emotional manipulation had successfully converted weekend workshop participants into willing participants in his version of enlightened adultery. Sunday morning, I positioned my cameras to document the private sessions. What I recorded was definitive proof of Soren's fraudulent practices, intimate encounters disguised as spiritual instruction, involving participants who had been systematically manipulated into abandoning their normal relationship boundaries. The most damaging footage showed Soren working individually with 3 different women while their husbands waited outside, convinced they were supporting their wives' spiritual development by allowing private healing sessions with the enlightened teacher. But the most personally painful recording was of Iris, who'd become Soren's co-instructor for the advanced practices. I watched my wife help manipulate other couples into accepting relationship arrangements that would have been unthinkable to them a week earlier. "Marriage is just a social contract," she told one conflicted participant, "but what we're exploring here is soul connection that transcends legal categories. When you release your attachment to exclusive partnership, you open yourself to unlimited love." By Sunday afternoon, I had enough evidence to destroy Soren's operation completely. But I also had a deeper understanding of how thoroughly my wife had been converted to his belief system. She wasn't just having an affair, she'd become a true believer in Soren's philosophy, someone who genuinely believed that adultery represented spiritual evolution. I packed my equipment and hiked back to the campground, then drove to the ferry terminal for the return trip to Seattle. During the crossing, I reviewed the footage on my laptop and planned the most effective way to use the evidence I'd gathered. The workshop participants had provided their contact information during registration, including email addresses and social media profiles. Many were prominent members of their communities, business owners, professionals, people who valued their reputations and would be devastated by public exposure of their weekend activities. More importantly, several participants had mentioned their involvement in other spiritual communities and personal development organizations. If I could document how easily Soren had manipulated experienced workshop participants, I could create a scandal that would reverberate throughout the entire New Age community. Monday morning, I began editing the Sacred Shores footage into a comprehensive exposé. Unlike the earlier videos that focused on Soren's relationship with Iris, this material showed his systematic manipulation of multiple couples, his fraudulent claims about spiritual authority, and the financial exploitation that funded his luxurious lifestyle. I created 3 separate videos: a general exposé suitable for news media, a detailed documentary for legal proceedings, and a targeted compilation for the workshop participants themselves. Each version was designed for maximum impact with its intended audience. The first video went to investigative reporters at Seattle television stations and newspapers. I included background information about Soren's history of relocating when his activities attracted scrutiny, plus financial records showing how much money participants had paid for what amounted to expensive marriage counseling. The second video went to law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies. I documented evidence of fraud, tax evasion, and potential immigration violations that could result in criminal charges against Soren and his organization. The third video went directly to the Sacred Shores workshop participants. I sent each couple their own personalized compilation showing exactly how they'd been manipulated and exploited during their weekend of spiritual exploration. The response was immediate and devastating. By Tuesday evening, 3 couples had contacted lawyers about potential civil suits against Sacred Shores. 2 participants had filed complaints with state consumer protection agencies. The retreat center's phone lines were jammed with cancellation requests from people who'd registered for upcoming workshops. Wednesday morning brought the news I'd been hoping for. A Seattle television station was preparing an investigative report about fraudulent spiritual teachers who prey on vulnerable people seeking personal growth. The story would air Friday night and feature extensive footage from Sacred Shores Retreat Center. But the most satisfying development came Wednesday afternoon, when Petra Lindgren called me directly. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Petra from the ashram. I think we need to talk." We met at a coffee shop in Bellingham, far enough from Seattle to ensure privacy for our conversation. Petra looked exhausted, like someone who'd been wrestling with difficult decisions for several days. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far," she began. "When I first started studying with Soren, his teaching seemed genuine. But after watching what happened this weekend, I realize I've been enabling something terrible." "What changed your mind?" "Seeing him work with those couples, the way he systematically broke down their resistance, convinced them to abandon their values, manipulated them into situations they'd never normally accept. It was like watching a predator in action." Petra opened her laptop and showed me files she'd copied from Sacred Shore's computer system. Financial records, participant databases, email correspondence between Soren and his various business partners. "He's been running this operation for years," she said. "Different locations, different names, but always the same pattern. He targets affluent spiritual seekers, especially women going through life transitions. Divorces, empty nest syndrome, midlife crises, people who are vulnerable and searching for meaning." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I helped him do it. I recruited students, managed his social media presence, created the marketing materials that made his programs seem legitimate. I'm responsible for what happened to your wife and dozens of other people." I studied Petra's face, trying to assess her motives. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but I'd learned to be skeptical of anyone connected to Soren's organization. "What do you want from me?" "I want to help you destroy him completely. Not just shut down Sacred Shores, but make sure he can never do this again anywhere else." She explained that Soren maintained detailed records of his students' personal information, financial situations, and emotional vulnerabilities. He used this data to identify the most promising targets for financial exploitation and to customize his manipulation techniques for maximum effectiveness. "He has files on everyone," Petra said. "Psychological profiles, family histories, financial records. He studies people like a scientist studying lab rats." "Where are these files?" "On servers in 3 different locations: Seattle, Portland, and Sacred Shores. I have access codes for all of them." Over the next 2 hours, Petra provided me with enough information to completely dismantle Soren's operation. Bank account numbers, business registrations, lease agreements, and most importantly, the personal files he'd compiled on hundreds of students over the past decade. "There's something else you should know," she said as we prepared to leave. "Soren is planning to disappear again. He's already transferred most of his money to offshore accounts and arranged new identity documents. If you're going to stop him, it has to be soon." That evening, I called Detective Ray Sullivan and arranged to meet him the next morning. The evidence Petra had provided was sufficient to support criminal charges for fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft. But I wanted to ensure that Soren faced consequences beyond just legal prosecution. I spent the night compiling a comprehensive dossier on Soren Valk's entire operation, his real identity, his criminal history, his methods of manipulation, and his network of shell companies and offshore accounts. By morning, I had assembled enough information to destroy him personally, professionally, and financially. Thursday morning, I delivered copies of the dossier to law enforcement agencies, news organizations, and regulatory bodies in Washington, Oregon, and California. I also sent copies to yoga associations, spiritual communities, and personal development organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. But my most important delivery was to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Soren's tax evasion was extensive and well documented, providing federal authorities with grounds to freeze his assets and prevent his planned disappearance. By Thursday afternoon, Sacred Shores Retreat Center was crawling with investigators. Federal agents, state regulators, and local law enforcement officers were executing search warrants and interviewing staff members. Soren Valk was arrested at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Amsterdam with a passport bearing a name I'd never heard before. His bail was set at $2 million, an amount that would have been easily affordable a week earlier, but impossible now that his assets were frozen pending investigation. Friday evening, I watched the television exposé from my living room, drinking bourbon and feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced since my police days. The investigative report was thorough and devastating, featuring interviews with former students, financial experts, and law enforcement officials who explained exactly how Soren's operation had functioned. But the most powerful segment featured Iris herself, interviewed at Sacred Shores before Soren's arrest. The footage showed her defending his teachings and explaining how sacred intimacy had transformed her understanding of love and relationship. Watching my wife speak passionately about spiritual concepts that were obviously designed to justify adultery, I realized that my campaign against Soren had succeeded beyond my expectations. I'd destroyed his organization, exposed his criminal activities, and ensured that he would never again be able to prey on vulnerable people seeking spiritual guidance. The only question that remained was what would happen to my marriage. Iris returned from Sacred Shores on Saturday morning, driving a rental car and carrying the same 2 suitcases she'd left with 2 weeks earlier. She looked exhausted, defeated, like someone emerging from a dream to find reality, waiting with a collection notice. I was drinking coffee on our front porch when she pulled into the driveway. She sat in the car for several minutes, staring at our house as if trying to remember what it had once meant to her. "The retreat center is closed," she said when she finally approached the porch. "Federal agents seized everything, computers, financial records, even our personal belongings. I heard about that. They're calling Soren a criminal. They're saying he defrauded students and manipulated vulnerable people for financial gain." She sat down in the chair across from me, the same spot where we'd shared coffee and conversation for 15 years of marriage. But everything felt different now, the comfortable familiarity replaced by the awkward tension of 2 strangers trying to navigate an impossible situation. "Do you believe them?" I asked. "I don't know what to believe anymore. The agents showed me financial records, email correspondence, files that Soren kept on all his students. They said he'd been planning to disappear with over $3 million. What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I thought he was a spiritual teacher helping people heal their relationship patterns. That I believed his teachings about sacred intimacy and conscious partnership." Iris looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete bewilderment, like someone who'd discovered that their entire understanding of reality was based on carefully constructed lies. "Nathan, I need you to know that I genuinely believed what he was teaching. The affair, the spiritual justifications, the plans to leave our marriage. I thought I was evolving, becoming a more enlightened person." "I know. You know? I know you believed it. That's what made it so effective. Soren didn't just seduce you physically, he converted you to a belief system that made adultery seem like spiritual growth." She stared at me for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd said. "You investigated him." "Yes." "You recorded our private sessions." "Yes." "You destroyed his organization." "Yes." Iris stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at our neighborhood with its neat lawns and conventional families living their conventional lives. "How long have you known?" "Since your second private session. I installed cameras at the ashram and documented everything." "Everything? Your affair, his manipulation techniques, the financial fraud, his plans to relocate when things got complicated. I have footage of him explaining to other students how to use spiritual language to justify abandoning their marriages." She turned back to me, and I saw something in her face that might have been relief. The expression of someone who'd been carrying a secret that had become too heavy to bear. "Are you going to use it against me in the divorce?" "What divorce?" "The divorce you're obviously planning. I betrayed our marriage, humiliated you publicly, abandoned you for a man who turned out to be a criminal." You have every right to hate me. I set down my coffee and really looked at my wife, not the enlightened spiritual seeker she'd been pretending to be, but the confused, wounded person who'd been manipulated by an expert predator. I don't hate you, Iris. I hate what happened to you. I hate that someone took advantage of your desire for growth and twisted it into something destructive. But I don't hate you. I don't understand. Soren Valk is a professional manipulator. He's spent years perfecting techniques for identifying vulnerable people and converting them to his belief system. What happened to you has happened to dozens of other people. That doesn't excuse what I did. No, it doesn't, but it explains it. And understanding something is the first step toward fixing it. Iris sat back down and looked at me with an expression that reminded me of the woman I'd married. Practical, intelligent, capable of recognizing uncomfortable truths about herself and the world. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. I want to understand how I became someone I don't recognize. I want to figure out how to live with what I've done. And I want to know if there's any possibility of rebuilding what I destroyed. Over the next several hours, we had the most honest conversation of our marriage. Iris described her gradual conversion to Soren's belief system, how his teachings had provided spiritual justification for feelings and desires she'd been struggling with for years. I was bored, she admitted. Bored with our routine, bored with my life, bored with being a middle-aged woman whose biggest excitement was choosing between yoga classes. When Soren talked about transcending limitations and embracing authentic self-expression, it felt like permission to become someone more interesting. More interesting than what? Than a suburban housewife whose husband took her for granted and whose biggest accomplishment was mastering advanced yoga poses. I absorbed this assessment of our marriage, recognizing truths I'd been avoiding for years. We had fallen into routines that prioritized comfort over growth, stability over excitement, familiar patterns over genuine intimacy. You're right, I said. I did take you for granted. I assumed our marriage was solid because we didn't fight, because we shared responsibilities efficiently, because we'd built a comfortable life together. But you never took me for granted the way Soren did. He studied me like a target, identified my vulnerabilities, and exploited them systematically. Everything he told me about spiritual growth was designed to make me more dependent on his guidance. Iris showed me copies of emails that federal investigators had recovered from Soren's computers, correspondence that revealed his calculated approach to manipulating students. He called me Project Iris in his notes, she said. He documented my emotional patterns, my financial situation, my relationship dissatisfactions. He planned every step of my seduction months in advance. Reading Soren's clinical analysis of my wife's psychology was disturbing and illuminating. He'd identified her midlife restlessness, her spiritual seeking, her desire for deeper meaning, and systematically exploited each vulnerability. Look at this, she said, pointing to an email exchange between Soren and one of his associates. He's discussing strategy for separating me from my support network, meaning you, my sister, my friends who might question his influence. The documents revealed that Soren's spiritual teachings were entirely tactical, designed to isolate students from external influences and make them more susceptible to his control. Sacred intimacy was just his way of normalizing infidelity, Iris said. Conscious partnership meant abandoning commitment to anyone except him. Divine love meant giving him money and personal access while believing I was growing spiritually. How do you feel about that now? Humiliated, angry, grateful that someone stopped him before he could do more damage. She looked at me with an expression that was part curiosity, part admiration. How did you know what to do? How did you put together such an effective campaign against him? 20 years of police work. You learned to build cases methodically, to gather evidence systematically, to identify the most effective pressure points for bringing down criminal operations. You treated our marriage like a criminal investigation. I treated Soren's organization like a criminal investigation. Our marriage was collateral damage that I hoped to repair once the real problem was eliminated. That evening, we ordered takeout and continued talking, not about spiritual growth or conscious partnership, but about practical questions of how to rebuild trust, intimacy, and shared purpose in a marriage that had been nearly destroyed by outside manipulation. "I don't know if I can forgive myself for what I did," Iris said. "Forgiveness isn't the issue. Understanding is the issue. Learning from what happened is the issue. Making sure it never happens again is the issue." How do we do that? By building a marriage that's strong enough to resist manipulation. By creating the kind of intimacy and excitement that makes external seduction less appealing. By staying alert to the warning signs of predatory behavior. We spent the next week having conversations that we probably should have had years earlier, about our individual needs, our shared goals, our assumptions about marriage and commitment. The crisis had forced us to examine our relationship with an honesty that had been missing for too long. I realize now that I was looking for someone to blame for my dissatisfaction with life, Iris said during one of these conversations. Soren gave me permission to blame you, our marriage, conventional society, anyone except myself. And I was looking for someone to blame for the distance that had developed between us. When I discovered your affair, it was almost a relief to have a clear villain instead of having to examine my own contributions to our problems. The media attention surrounding Soren's arrest created additional challenges. Our names appeared in news reports about Sacred Shores, and several neighbors recognized Iris from the television exposé. We had to navigate the social awkwardness of being publicly associated with a spiritual fraud scandal, but the publicity also brought unexpected support. 3 other couples contacted us, people whose marriages had been damaged by similar spiritual teachers and who wanted to share their experiences of recovery and rebuilding. We're not the only ones this has happened to, Iris realized after meeting with one of these couples. There's an entire network of predatory spiritual teachers who use the same methods Soren used. This discovery led to Iris's next phase of healing, working with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy groups to help identify and prosecute fraudulent spiritual teachers. Her inside knowledge of Soren's methods made her a valuable resource for understanding how these operations functioned. "I want to make sure other people don't go through what we went through," she told me. "I want to use what I learned about manipulation techniques to help people recognize and resist them." 6 months after Soren's arrest, Iris started a blog called Spiritual Fraud Survivors that documented the tactics used by predatory teachers and provided resources for people who'd been victimized by spiritual manipulation. The blog attracted thousands of readers and connected survivors from around the world. "It's strange," she said one evening as we reviewed comments from her latest post. "I'm finally doing the meaningful work I was looking for, but it came from the worst experience of my life." Maybe that's how real growth happens, not through spiritual teachings or conscious workshops, but through surviving actual challenges and helping other people do the same. Our marriage didn't return to its previous state. It became something entirely different. More honest, more intentional, more aware of the work required to maintain genuine intimacy. We'd learned that relationships aren't maintained through comfortable routines, but through continuous effort to understand and support each other's evolution. "Do you think we would have figured this out if Soren hadn't happened?" Iris asked one night as we were getting ready for bed. "I don't know. Maybe we would have continued drifting apart until we ended up divorced for conventional reasons instead of spiritual ones. So, in a weird way, he did us a favor. He did us a favor by getting arrested before he could steal your inheritance and disappear to Europe with his next victim." Iris laughed, the first completely natural laugh I'd heard from her since before she'd discovered the Lotus Ashram. "You know what I learned from all this?" she said. "What?" "Sacred intimacy isn't something you learn from a guru. It's something you build with someone who knows you well enough to destroy you, but chooses to save you instead." I looked at my wife, scarred by her experience with spiritual fraud, but stronger for having survived it, committed to using her painful education to protect other people from similar predators. "I love you," I said. "I love you too. The real kind of love, not the divine transcendent kind that justifies betraying the people who actually care about you. Just regular old possessive, fear-based, conventional love. Exactly. The kind that makes you install surveillance cameras and build federal cases against people who threaten your marriage. The kind that makes you choose your husband over your guru when you finally understand the difference between spiritual growth and spiritual fraud." We turned off the lights and lay in the darkness of our bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of our neighborhood settling into sleep. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of authentic relationships and manipulative ones, genuine spiritual seeking and predatory exploitation, real love and convincing imitations. But inside our house, two people who'd nearly lost each other to a sophisticated con artist were learning to build something more durable than enlightenment. A marriage based on mutual knowledge, shared purpose, and the kind of sacred intimacy that doesn't require a guru to explain or justify it. The last thing I heard before falling asleep was Iris whispering, "Thank you for not giving up on us." "Thank you for coming home," I whispered back. And in the morning, we would continue the real work of building a life together. Not the mystical, transcendent kind that spiritual teachers promise, but the practical, daily kind that actually lasts.